Hi, guys. So, in this next section, we are going to be talking about the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. And we're really going to try to answer, what were the causes of those revolutions and the effects of those revolutions in Europe in the 1830s and 1848. So, again, if you think back to the previous lesson, there is a variety of factors that are at play here in terms of causes. So, you've got the conservatives who are trying to go back to the old way of doing things. And they're trying to slow things up and they're not wanting too much change. Remember, they want to keep the status quo. Then you have the liberals who are pushing for pretty substantial changes. So they want constitutions that look like the United States, they want guaranteed free speech, those types of things. And then you've got this growing call of nationalism. And so all these things are all under the surface and kind of boiling, right? So we're going to look at some of the ways that French rebels are going to get some reforms, how the spirit of reform is going to spread throughout Europe, and then the revolutions that surged through France and the rest of Europe in 1848. So, first, when we look at citizens in the July Revolution, what you have is you have Louis the 18th, I believe, who he comes back into power after Napoleon. Remember that he was placed back on the throne in France after Napoleon's defeat by the Congress of Vienna. So he's reestablished, right? The monarchy's reestablished. And the king of France, Louis the 18th, he agrees to a limited monarchy. And so France has a king again, but it also has a constitution. And when Louis the 18th is done and died in 1824, then a man named Charles the 10th becomes king. And what you're looking at is that Charles rejects this idea of this French charter. And this charter, this was a constitution that was created in France during Louis XVIII's reign, and it created a legislature in France and allowed limited freedom of the press. And Charles X, he doesn't want that limited monarchy. He doesn't want that constitution. As far as he's concerned, he's a divine right king. He gets his authority from God. He's that kind of a guy. So he decides, you know what, I'm going to suspend the legislature. I'm going to limit the right to vote again and restrict the press. I'm not going to allow complete freedom of the press. And what you get is you get liberals and radicals are people who favored extreme changes. So radicals and liberals throughout France say, whoa, 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 whoa. We've been there, we've done that. We didn't go through this whole French Revolution just so we could go back to the way it was before, because that didn't work either. We didn't like that. And so pretty quickly, Charles X realizes that his time is probably up. He's pretty limited, and so he decides to get the heck out of Dodge. He decides to leave, to flee France before people get too ticked off and maybe end up chopping his head off. And, you can see where the past is probably weighing kind of heavily on him. He knows what's coming, so he leaves. And what ends up happening is this bourgeoisie, this middle class, they seek out Louis Philippe, this bourgeoisie liberal middle class, the liberals in France, and they seek out a man named Louis Philippe. So when Louis Philippe comes in, he's going to take the title of Citizen King. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the things to point out here is if we look at right here, Louis Philippe, this picture, if we take a look at him and how he's dressed. So Charles X, the guy that he replaced, the divine right ruler, Charles X dressed kind of old style monarch, right? In the robe, right? Very regal. Whereas Louis Philippe, as you can see in this picture, he's dressing in a more modern style. So that kind of goes to show you how this shift is going to take place and what it's going to look like. So Louis Philippe is the Citizen King. The reason why he takes on the nickname Citizen King is that because he didn't want the awesome, he didn't want Louis the Awesome, the Terrific, the Great, like maybe other people had taken on those titles. What he really wants to do is he wants to clearly highlight this point right here. Back here in the bottom, right? Popular sovereignty, that the king rules by the will of the people, the citizens, not by the will of God. And because moderate liberals pick him, and he's a friend of the bourgeoisie, and he's kind of an easygoing guy anyway, he likes to hang out with people, he talks to people, he's very personable, and all those things make him a very well liked figure. And so things are going to go along pretty well with him until a little bit later on when things get a little crazy in France again. So if we look at some reforms that succeeded and some reforms that failed during this time, or some revolutions that were successful and some that failed. Belgium was able to win their independence, right? So this is a little bit of an aside. So we'll get back to France later. So Belgium is a country, becomes an independent country. The problem was that Belgium was thrown into a single country with the Dutch, with the Netherlands, by the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon's defeat, when they redrew Europe's borders. And the Dutch and the Belgians are very different from each other. The Dutch people are Protestant Christians. They're typically involved in trade. That's the type of work that they did. Whereas Belgium is mostly Roman Catholic. They're involved in manufacturing jobs. They speak French. So, whereas the Dutch obviously speak Dutch. So even linguistically, these places are different from each other, the Netherlands and Belgium. So they've been forced into a single country. And so when Belgium does move to win independence from the Netherlands, the rest of Europe is actually fairly supportive of that because they realize there are some key differences between them. And they also realize that there may be some advantages for them in Belgium gaining their independence and the Dutch being independent. So when you think about how some of these rebellions are crushed, sometimes they're supported, like in Belgium or like with Greece in our previous lesson. Poland, on the other hand, is one of the revolutions that fails. And there's a couple of lessons in Poland for people who are pushing revolution. So Poland doesn't really have the strong, cohesive idea of what they want to gain besides independence. They want to come back onto the map as an independent Poland, but they have lots of groups outside of wanting to become Poland again that they're not going to work with each other afterwards, right? Their only goal is independence, but they don't really share much else in common. And so because these rebels don't gain widespread support from everyone in Poland, and they're kind of working against each other in some cases, it never gives them the ability to unite completely and to have a successful revolution. And then on top of that, Russian forces are brought in. Russian military forces are brought in, and they don't want to see Poland become independent. They want to continue to hang on to Poland and to have control over Poland. And so they are able to crush that independence movement and block efforts from being able to do it. So in some cases, these revolutions worked, like in Belgium, and in some cases they failed, like in Poland. So let's go back to France, right? When we last left off, Louis Philippe was in power. Right? Louis Philippe had taken power in the Revolution of 1830, if I go back. This was his program. Remember, he's more supported by the moderate liberals, the bourgeoisie, right? This is 1830. Now, we're going to move on to the next revolution. So when we last left off, Philippe was in power and things are going along pretty well for him until 1848. 1848, the radicals are calling for even more changes than there were before, especially this growing working class within France, who really are outside of that middle upper class bourgeoisie. And so the radicals, they're wanting changes that help benefit the workers, everyday workers. Another factor comes into play in that there is a recession that hits, right? And a recession is a period of economic decline or reduced economic activity. And it makes it really tough for people to buy food and bread and all those types of things again. And so with the call for more changes and then this economic downturn, it adds all the fuel that you need to the fire for something to happen. And the moment that the government under Louis Philippe begins to limit free speech, because they're tired of hearing the radicals complain, and they're tired of hearing about the recession, and they're tired of hearing the critics complain. So they smack down on the free press and free speech. And that action that the government takes under Louis Philippe mobilizes the people, and they come out and they're able to overthrow the government and create a second republic. And Louis Philippe is gone. And one of the problems that the Second Republic runs into is that it lacks unity. And so we really see that in the June days of this French revolt in 1848. So because the working class wanted a lot of these changes to help support them financially, which is what these workshops were. And it was a way of providing kind of social welfare to help the working class. So basically, what had happened was the French government had been providing these national workshops, and these national workshops were meant to provide jobs to the unemployed of France. Well, the middle class resented using their wealth to pay for these workshops and the taxes that were associated with it. The peasants were afraid that the workers wanted to create a socialist system where they would take the farmers' lands and the peasants would be thrown off the land. And so what you get is these groups, these factions splitting apart and fighting against each other. And that's what happens in the June days of the revolution. So, with all of that craziness and chaos, what many people want is to go back to normal again, to some stability. And that's where, Napoleon III comes to power. So, Napoleon is popular with both the liberals and the conservatives, and maybe even a little bit, maybe the radicals. So the reason he is supported by the conservatives is they see this as a move back to the glory days of France, when under Napoleon the First, France ruled Europe. And so for conservatives, they see this as a good move, back to when France was at its height, when it was at the height of its power. For the liberal bourgeoisie, the liberal class, the bourgeoisie, they see him as being a good move, a good choice for the leader of France, because he's going to bring stability. He's going to bring the ability for the economy to get back on its feet again, to fix this recession that's going on, and to kind of get things going again. And it's going to prevent the far left radicals from totally upheaving the whole system. That's what the liberals were hoping for in having the new Napoleon III in power. And just like his uncle, Napoleon III, what he does is he has a plebiscite. Remember, a plebiscite. So he gives all adult men the right to vote. So that goes from being like 200,000 people being able to vote to something like 9 million people. Not that you need to know that exact number, but obviously there's a huge increase in the number of people who are going to vote. And then when he has the plebiscite, all of these new voters are probably going to vote for him, right? Because he gave them the right to vote in the first place. And that's the key difference between this revolution in France in 1848 with Napoleon III and the revolution of 1830 when Louis Philippe comes to power. In this revolution in 1848, the people literally voted for Napoleon III into power. Whereas in 1830, Louis Philippe was chosen as a king in a constitutional monarchy to replace Charles X. And he was not chosen through a vote of the people. So that's the key difference here. So anyway, France gets all crazy. They get back to where they started in the first place. That's kind of the theme here. So with these movements that are happening in the 1830s and 1848, you're going to see these revolutions sweep through Europe. And so the Austrian Empire has all these nationalistic groups that are fighting for their independence. So there's changes in the Austrian Empire. There's revolts in Italy and in the German states to try and gain some sense of autonomy. And what that's going to do is it's going to eventually lead to Italy and Germany becoming modern countries here, unified countries pretty soon. But essentially what's happening with these surges throughout Europe is in general, peoples around the world they all want the same thing. They all want to be able to believe what they believe. They want to be able to say what they want to say, short of hurting other people. They want freedom of press. They want all these really basic human rights. And they want a government that makes sure that those are protected. And what's happening is the people in Europe in the 1840s feel like their governments aren't providing that. What happened in the Arab Spring beginning in, let's say, 2010, 2011, if you've ever heard of that or remember that, it swept through the Middle East. It's the same thing. They believe, just as the people in the 1840s believe, that their governments aren't protecting their basic human rights. And so it goes from one country to another country, to another country, as they raise up the call and say, if you can't give us these rights, then we want to get rid of you and get a government that will protect these rights. Now, eventually, these revolutions, both in 1848 and in the Arab Spring, fail. So they are different from the revolutions of France. The other revolutions around Europe in 1848 fail. Keep that in mind. Whereas the revolutions in France were successful. And the reasons they fail, There's a handful of reasons. One is the governments have control over the military. And so when you have these revolutions taking place, the military is quickly able to come in and to squash them. The other problem you run into is that these groups want change, but outside of that, for example, when we go to the French Revolution, the radicals and the liberals don't see eye to eye on what that change looks like. So even though you have these revolutions, afterwards, a lot of times these groups they go to war against each other and they have a civil war trying to create the country that they want for themselves. So they lack mass support, they lack unity. And the other thing you see is that with these constitutions, the governments withdraw them, replace them, rewrite them to kind of their own benefit. One example is in Hungary, where Hungarian nationalists were led by a journalist named Louis Kossuth, who demanded an independent government for Hungary. He wanted Hungary to be independent from the Austrian Empire. He wanted an end to serfdom and a written constitution to protect basic rights. And what ends up happening is the Austrians send in the military and the Austrian troops and regained control and smashed the rebels in Budapest in Hungary. So you can see the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, the conservatives were successful in stopping these liberal revolutions in 1848, pretty much everywhere except for in France. And so the government and the rulers have an awful lot of power in terms of the constitutions, being able to change those things and rewrite the rules. And they have the support of the military. And a lot of times that's why those liberal revolutions of 1848 fail. But along with the failures of those revolutions, the failure creates a refugee crisis. Just like with the Syrian civil war and the Arab Spring, there's a great deal of refugees who are fleeing the country, either because they protested against the government or they lost the revolution and they fear for their lives. And this is going on still to this day. The same thing happened in Europe in the 1840s, is then they leave the country after the failure of the revolution and they try and find a new place to live. And so the effects of these revolutions, the failure of these revolutions, is that there's mass migration, people immigrating to other countries. And so in the 1840s, the United States provided, this is an example, the United States provided an opportunity for those people on the losing ends of those revolutions in places like in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, to come here. And currently the world is, unfortunately, as you can see from these pictures, currently today, the world isn't as receptive. So there are people who are trying to escape from Arab countries, from Syria. There's a refugee crisis taking place today, and people literally try to cross oceans, to cross seas, to escape. And unfortunately, many of them drown, right, and are unable to make it to Europe or to the United States. So it's pretty sad to see. So that's it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll make sure to help you out.